you to the Middle East Institute for inviting me to speak to you today about a very complex topic with 40 minutes to try and say everything that I can about the Arab uprisings that's of relevance. So I will do my best to take you through and try and highlight some of the key components that we think are relevant. But obviously, with something of this complexity, there's going to be a lot of elements that I have to gloss over quickly, given the time constraints. So by all means, if there are other things that you want me to discuss that I don't cover, please bring them up in the Q&A. I couldn't really hear the introduction very well, but I believe I've already been introduced. I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at the Gulf University for Science and Technology in Kuwait, and was previously a postdoc fellow at the Middle East Institute there in Singapore. And that was back in 2011, coincidentally, within sort of the end of the time frame of the initial period that we'll talk about with the Arab uprisings today. As a result, we convened a conference about the Arab uprisings, which I helped organize, and then I was the lead editor on a book that we put together on the topic called The Arab Uprisings, Catalyst, Dynamics, and Trajectories. And so today's talk is going to follow the same basic format that we had in the book itself, which is talking about the catalyst, what were some of the conditions that led to the uprisings themselves, the dynamics, or what kind of things happened on the ground with the uprisings, and the trajectories, of course, are where things headed since then, and where do we think they're going? Excuse me. So I'll go ahead and jump into it. And I'll start by sort of giving the typical vignette or narrative that people give when they're talking about the Arab uprisings and how they started, which is a story many of you probably are already familiar with. That is the story of Mohammed Bouazizi in the Tunisian country of Sidi Bouzid. And he was a fruit vendor who had apparently been humiliated by some local police, ostensibly about not having the proper permit to sell his fruit. It could have been a shakedown for bribes. It could have just been an attempted humiliation. I don't think we'll ever really know the full story. But we do know the consequences of that exchange, where that he went and after his cart was confiscated, out of frustration, he went and grabbed some a canister of gasoline, poured it on himself, and set himself on fire. And that tragic incident, while he didn't pass away at the time, he did die later in the hospital of his injuries, really struck a chord with a lot of people in Tunisia. They empathized with his frustrations, the humiliation he had faced, the lack of economic opportunity, the abuse of authority. Many of the things that were problems in his case were problems for a lot of people. And as a result, it really set something off. And protests started in several cities around Tunisia. And these were facilitated to a large degree by social media, and the fact that you didn't have to rely on state-driven media to see what was happening. It was now people who were the media makers, so to speak, and were showing what was happening. And this, of course, as you know, had implications far beyond Tunisia. It spread to a number of other countries, in a manner of speaking, in Libya, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Syria. And part of how it spread, yes, social media certainly helped highlight or draw attention to the protest, but obviously the media themselves do not a protest make. The protests were very much a symptom, you might say, of shared conditions across many of the countries in the region. Now, one of the points I want to make before talking about the region as a whole, of course, is that every country is quite specific and unique. There are, of course, shared conditions, there's shared language, there's shared religious affiliations, etc. But one of the dangers in talking about something like the Arab uprisings or even the Middle East in general as a region is the danger that people might start seeing the place as quite homogenous, which it's not. But with that caveat, we'll start talking about some of the consistent factors that led to the uprisings across these countries and what happened in them and what has happened since. We are just about 3 weeks shy of the 8-year anniversary of those tragic events in Sidi Bouzid. And when we look at what's happened as a result of the uprisings, we see that maybe with the exception of Tunisia to some degree, most of the countries that experienced major upheavals are not in a better position than they were at the time the uprisings happened. And that certainly wasn't how people were looking at it at the time, as I'll discuss. We have Libya in turmoil, Syria and Yemen are in civil wars. You've got Egypt is under worse authoritarian control than it's been in decades. Bahrain is a boiling cauldron, ready to, I think, crack at least at some point. Now, Tunisia is moving forward, and they are trying hard to consolidate democracy, but it's a very difficult task. And it's one where maybe the political system is going through major reconstitution, but the social and the economic conditions are still fairly dire there. This is really what we're going to do. I've just kind of given you the introduction. We're going to now step into a little bit more about the background behind all of this, and then what were some of the catalysts and conditions that we've identified with the various researchers we were working with on the book as key considerations, but I think ones that are pretty universally recognized as contributors. Then again, the dynamics, trajectories, and conclusions. So if we start with the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the background itself. And I want to clarify a few terms before we go through. As an academic, I guess we like to always clarify our terms maybe before we get into details. But I want to explain sort of the difference between things like revolution and uprising. Now, the reason they're not called the Arab revolutions is revolutions really indicate a fundamental change in the political organization itself. That is, the powers that be have been overthrown and new powers come in that are something different. We're not really seeing this significantly in most of the places. You might say that Tunisia was a type of revolution, but certainly for the other countries, you can't. Now, if we go to the next click there, I also mentioned that there's a civil war happening, at least in Syria, in Yemen. You could argue also in Libya. And what do I mean by this? Just to clarify, of course, is this is a war between opposing groups or citizens within the same country. Now, especially in the case of Yemen and Syria, it's not just a civil war, it's what we call a proxy war. That is, there are a number of geopolitical interests that are involved in trying to shape the outcomes of those conflicts as well. So it's a civil war with geopolitical overtones, you might say. If we go to the next thing, then we come to the question of Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, and Arab Uprisings. I think it's important to clarify this. The standard nomenclature, I think, that's become sort of the colloquial usage of how we talk about the events that happened in late 2010 and in 2011 in the Middle East and the Arab countries, was to call it the Arab Spring. And I think this is a little bit dangerous, even to call it the Arab Uprisings. I mean, the Arab Awakening, because what it does is it sort of dehistoricizes. It makes it seem like there's this temporal thing that's occurred. If it's an awakening, it's something that the Arabs were perhaps sleeping before and all of a sudden decided to wake up to the conditions around them. If you call it an Arab Spring, again, it sounds like it's something that's just for a temporary season, and then it disappears. Now, I know this isn't a reference to previous historical conditions in other parts of the world, but we have chosen to focus, to use the term uprisings, because out of all of these different ways of talking about what we saw, the most consistent thing we can see is that the populations, to a large degree, or large numbers of the population, at least to make it politically significant, rose up against the powers that be, and in many cases caused some kind of political reorganization, though not the one that most were going for. And so this is why I'll focus on the term the Arab uprisings. And I should also point out another reason why we don't want to talk about this in terms of springs and awakenings is what we saw was certainly new in many ways in terms of the scale, the speed, the scope. But other forms of revolt within the Arab countries is certainly not new. I mean, just to give you an idea, just since the end of World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that led to the French and the British dividing up much of the post-Ottoman Empire into new colonial spoils of war, there have been various revolutionary or rebellious movements in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq 6 times, Iran, Palestine, Algeria, Lebanon, Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Bahrain, etc. So this was not an awakening. This was more like a larger seismic shift than we had seen before, but it didn't come out of nowhere. I would say that in order to understand sort of the catalyst, what were the conditions that led to this, we can talk about the political, the economic, the social, and the technological dimensions. There were various elements of all 4 of these that were significantly different than in previous situations that I just mentioned. The point that I want to make is there's no just one thing that was different, and that's probably the one thing that was different. It was a combination of several key factors that came together at a particular moment in time that created, you might say, the right kindling, although forgive the metaphor, for this to happen. And so this confluence of factors is important to understand. Again, there's no monocausal explanation. That is one thing that explains it all. So if we talk about the political conditions, now these, many of them are the same and have been the same, both under colonial rule and later under the various Arab authoritarian regimes, and that is the role of the deep state, the heavily militarized states, various degrees of authoritarianism, and this is something that is pretty consistent across the Arab countries. Now, how authoritarian each place is, of course, varies. I mean, I'm in Kuwait, for example. It's quite a bit different than, say, some of our neighbors. But to some degree, all of the Arab countries face a type of authoritarian control. I think another political condition, you might say, would be the way that these states were not only authoritarian, but highly dysfunctional. That is, they failed to deliver. Highly corrupt. Many of them have sort of clientelistic structures. That is where the state uses its financial resources to buy loyalty from potential figures. People close to the government tend to do well. People not so close, not so well. High degrees of inefficiency, the failure to deliver on things like employment opportunities, efficient governance, proper electricity, sanitation, etc. Many countries, especially outside of the oil-rich countries of the Arabian Peninsula, really struggle with basic services. And then I've already mentioned the clientelism. You also have states of the region that were highly dependent. So when I'm saying highly dependent, there were regional hegemons. So various states within the region influence other states, maybe disproportionately. You also have global interest, and these global interests will influence further. Sorry, just one second. Let me turn down my microphone there. Will also influence what's going on. So you have states essentially that are ineffectual, highly authoritarian, and very subject to geopolitical influence, and often making decisions based off of geopolitics that are not always in the best interest of the populations. And not that this is entirely new in the Middle East, but the degree to which this has become entrenched and the amount of time people have had to tolerate this, I think, helped lead to some of the breaking points. That is, you have governments that do not properly serve the people. Now, if we go from the political conditions, we then find the economic. And in terms of economic conditions, the Middle East is a region, according to the various reports, such as I forget the name, but I think it's called the World Economic Disparity Report or something. The Middle East, for the last 30 years, has been the country or the area of the world with the highest disparity between the richest and the poorest people. And after 30 years of large amounts of people living on less than $2 a day, and a handful of states or individuals that are amongst the wealthiest in the world, this creates a lot of animosity, obviously, this economic disparity. You also have extremely high levels of unemployment, and you tie this, as I'm going to talk about, to the youth bulge and the fact that we have very young populations, as I'll get to. It leads to some serious issues. Now, this, of course, is not across the board. If we look at some of the countries, again, of the Arabian Peninsula, which have the natural resources for their countries, unemployment is not actually that bad at all. In Kuwait, where I am, for example, 90% of Kuwaitis are employed by the government. Again, this comes back to maybe a little bit of the clientelistic system and the poor inflated bureaucracies and all of these other things. But it's important to note that unemployment is not always universal, nor is the distribution of wealth or services. Another economic condition, and I think this was a very important one to think about, was the issue of food security. Now, very few countries within the region grow their own food, their own produce. So the Middle East in general is about an 80% net importer of its food. And these foods are further, especially in more developing areas within the region, subsidized heavily by the government. And so this means that when we have the global downturn preceding the uprisings in 2008 and 2009, you have this, say, double whammy of one, the cost of food imports goes up. And two, the state budgets are affected, just like countries around the world, by this global economic downturn, yet they still need to provide the financial subsidies for these increasingly expensive foodstuff. And that was a very large burden, and some of the countries in the region tried to change the subsidies arrangements. There were issues of food shortages and other things, and basically the idea of bread riots, I think, helps explain in some countries part of what was happening in terms of the economic conditions and how that affected people's feelings toward the state. So they have weak political conditions that are not responsive. They have economic conditions in an economic scenario in which the state cannot provide, and people have already been dealing with this high degree of stratification between the wealthy and the non-wealthy. And if we go to the next slide, a third area I want to talk about as a catalyst were the social conditions. Now, under the social conditions, I promised I'd talk briefly about the demography. The Middle East and North Africa, actually the Middle East and Africa as a whole, represent the main area of the world where we have very young populations. When it comes to family planning and population, you might say, management in many other countries around the world, you have often the opposite problem. You have aging populations and problems bringing in younger people who can fill those jobs that are being vacated. But in our part of the world, the family planning, for various reasons, is not something that is taught in schools. The government doesn't interfere in trying to reduce family sizes. As a matter of fact, in the Arabian Peninsula, most of the wealthy countries here actually give you subsidies or money every time you have more children if you're a national. So rather than the rest of the world, which is trying to reduce the population growth, in the Middle East, in some ways, it's encouraged. So we have big families. This means we have a very large portion of the population that is under 30, and they are increasingly better educated, but not able to find the jobs, as I mentioned. I'm going to, in the interest of time, move quickly through these others, but we can talk more about them. But certainly other social conditions to keep in mind is the role that religion plays. Religion has been often in an authoritarian context one of the only ways that people could assemble and collect and often discuss and debate things in a way that the state interference was minimal. That is, religious organizations and groups constitute a lot of what would otherwise be civil society, because civil society has been very strongly controlled throughout the Middle East. And for those of you who might study issues like transitology and democratization, civil society is a very important component for democratic development. So when you stump that, the only other place where you get a power center outside of the government, so to speak, is often in religious circles. You have a high degree of gender inequality, and this also ties to education. So I teach at a university here, and like many of my counterparts across the region, we have more females than males enrolled in university. But then when you go out and you look at the job market, we have definitely more males than females employed. And in some countries, this is highly exacerbated in places like Saudi Arabia, for example. So you've got these various social conditions that also create populations that are frustrated, that people are marginalized, that they're not necessarily able to express themselves in certain ways. So all of these things, I think, also play in on the social conditions. And finally, it should be noted, as most of the protesters across all of the places that had uprisings or even protests, because there were several countries besides the ones that I mentioned that had various marches and protests, including here in Kuwait, most people were demanding better social justice and more dignity. And I think that those two ideas, social justice and dignity, if you add to that maybe opportunity, really encapsulate the problems that were the catalyst leading to the uprisings. Now, one thing that was quite different, I think, than in the previous situations across the region where there were various revolts and attempted uprisings or revolutions is the next point. Thank you, and that is technology. Now, as a communication scholar, I have to, of course, give the caveat, I'm not being a technological determinist here. That is, someone who believes that it's technology that causes change. What I'm arguing here, and as we argue in the book, is technology becomes a very important tool for political change. And communication technologies, or media specifically. Now, this is not something that's entirely new to internet-based digital media, such as Facebook, for example. The same thing has happened with the advent of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg. Whether you're talking about the role of things like radio or television. In the Iranian Revolution, even cassette tapes played a big role. So technology always has some impact in terms of either political control or attempts at political change. And that certainly wasn't new with digital media in 2010 and 2011. But what was different was who had the opportunity to create that media. Prior to this, all the other forms of media I just briefly mentioned were things that really you have to have the resources to create, and the distribution networks and the technical capabilities. When you're talking about social media, not so much. I mean, many of you are on your phones right now. You're able to create media about this event if you want and circulate it as widely as you would like. And I think the power to create media that can be distributed to lots of people quickly and easily was different. I won't probably, I run the risk always as a communication scholar to talk too much about this. I won't get into a lot of the details about media and how I think this was relevant, but I will mention just a few points that we talk about in the book. And that is that the last point there, you can see there where it says preference, amplification, spotlighting, etc. I just want to explain what these were, because they were important factors. Preference amplification, if you're living in an authoritarian regime in which you have all these distorted social and economic conditions, you're probably going to be very disgruntled. But because it's a deep state, you'll probably also not know when it's safe to say you're disgruntled. With digital-based media, you can find other people who share your opinion. We call this preference amplification. You can find other people who are disgruntled. You can find other people who share your animosity, and that helps amplify your feeling that you're not alone in this. And that is something that's quite different. And we see this not just with the Arab uprisings. You see this preference amplification operating right now in political contexts across the world, where you see various people interacting with only people who see the world the way they do. Another implication of the media environment that is important to note was what we call the spotlighting effect. That is, because media making was now in the hands of citizens, they could draw attention to abuses by the state. For example, in Egypt, you had we were all Khalid Said. This was a Facebook page dedicated to a young man who had been tortured and killed by the Mubahith, the Secret Service within Egypt, and they organized several protests and got a lot of people to start sharing other information about police brutality in Egypt. So it has a spotlighting effect. Of course, the thing I think most people are familiar with in terms of how media have worked within the Arab uprisings was their organizing potential. Being able to organize protests, set particular times, dates, locations, and mobilizing people through those organizational tools to get out there. But it is important to also note that social media often, yes, while you can meet lots of new people that way, and we call this the weak ties, which is the last point there. That is, people that maybe you only know through social media, but could share an affinity and maybe decide to join together in a mobilization. Social media also works strongly through reinforcing existing networks that you already have. So it's not that the social media are the only ways that people organized and communicated. So that was it for my media side. I'll move on now out of the catalyst and conditions that I think were relevant, the social, the political, the economic, and the technological, and start talking about, well, then what did we see on the ground? Normally I would be asking if there are any questions up to this point, but given the fact that we can't communicate two-way very easily, hence the media is not working in our favor, I'll move forward. So I apologize for just a long monologue here. So dynamics, what happened on the ground? Well, when the uprisings began, the various regimes had different responses. There's the fight or flight. They could try and squish them using the heavy-handed security forces, or they could try and abscond, as some did. There could be, in terms of how you handle the media, there was attempts at cutting off the internet, as they did in Egypt, which would be the blackout, or to back out again. People like the leader of Tunisia, my goodness, not Ali, Zain bin Adin, bin Ali. He decided, for example, to try and use the fight approach, and then his military basically said, we will not do that. And when the military failed to back him, he had to abscond. The person I was just about to confuse him with was Ali Abdullah Saleh from Yemen. Also ended up having to leave the country and went off to Saudi Arabia. You had others like Hosni Mubarak, who the military started and the police forces to support him, but then it became clear that they would be better served by cutting him loose and pretending to support the people. They did that, and of course he was then arrested. Gaddafi threatened to go door to door, obviously to kill anyone who would try and rise up against him, and in the end he was the one who was caught and killed very brutally. And you have people like Assad in Syria, who basically has found success with fighting back, and that brutal civil war has lasted for a long period of time. So those were sort of the regimes and the military responses. The two things were tied closely together. Where the military supported, the dictators had maybe a better chance, you might say, of quelling the uprisings. And where the militaries didn't support, the leaders had no choice but to back out. Attempts, for example, in Egypt to cut off the internet backfired. When people couldn't go online to find out what was happening, they opened their front doors and went out on the streets. So it actually had both economic consequences in terms of when you shut down the internet for an entire country, but it also made the protest worse. Now, that's how they reacted. The global community was quite interesting. You had a mix. So many Western countries in the beginning, for example, the United States, a longtime ally and supporter of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, at first was confused. Should we support Hosni Mubarak, or do we get on the side of the population because it's clear that they may actually be able to kick him out? And so pretty quickly, Western governments started to at least portend the idea that they were on the side of the populations. And many governments did offer at least popular support, at least publicly. The media were quite interesting because the global media were very quick to draw up a grand narrative that what was happening was something across the region. It was a type of democratic contagion where everybody was fighting for democracy, and it was a youth-led, social media-driven wave of protest that were going to essentially usher in a new democratic era and reconfigure the nature of the Middle East. And I think that created a bit of a spectacle. That was a narrative that works well, for example, in a Hollywood film. But when it comes to real life, I believe that was much too ambitious to assume. And certainly, as we've seen, that wasn't what happened. And I should also point out that democracy was not the main call of many of the people in the uprisings. That was sort of the Western reading of it. So what happened? What else happened on the ground? Some initial outcomes, if we move forward, were at first we saw this great empowerment of these young populations that had been largely unemployed but fairly well educated and were technologically savvy. There were those components, really finding a political voice and building new communities. We also saw the media, as I mentioned, playing a big role. We saw women trying to fight for their rights, finding this as an opportunity, or other minorities trying to utilize this rupture as a chance to air their grievances. We saw some great artistic aspirations and expressions of sentiment of what was happening. Many people developed a very strong sense of national or regional or Arab pride. Now, those things are indoctrinated into a lot of people through the political systems and the educational systems here, but they're very much tied to the regimes. And here people saw rebellion against the regimes as in the national interest, which was new. And you saw a new sense of dignity, I think, from people. And that is a very important, I think, psychological component to keep in mind. And then finally, there were some discussions about what replaces the authoritarian regimes. Should it be more democratic, and what would it look like? And certainly these things were discussed, but because of the organic and spontaneous nature of the uprisings themselves, there were very little plans for what was going to happen after. And that is really, I would say, the biggest problem. The gentleman in the front row mentioned about one of the things was different was there was no core leadership that was leading the revolutions to create the change, I think, as I heard the question. And that's absolutely important because without some kind of predefined plan and some kind of organizational structure to carry on after the power vacuum is created, you leave it open for whoever the strongest player may be. And if we go to the next slide, let's talk about who these players were. For those countries that started experimenting with the democratic process and tried to usher in elections, we saw very clearly that there was a very consistent set of winners, and that was the Islamist. As I mentioned, with the lack of civil society, Islamist or Islamic organizations were one of the only places people could really congregate and share ideas. And so they were in a natural position to step in many places. Now, those didn't always work. In Tunisia, the Islamists have had to moderate their positions quite a bit to accommodate, and they've done a fairly good job of that. In Egypt, Mohamed Morsi was kicked out by a coup from the military. In other places, Islamic groups have morphed in some ways, especially in places like Libya or Syria, into more terrorist-based organizations. So the power vacuum that was created by a lack of a plan after the uprisings really is part of what's created these ongoing destabilizing events that we see. If you go to the next point here, these destabilizations only intensified many of the things people were upset about. They were upset about the economies, they were upset about jobs, they were upset about the lack of opportunities, they were upset about the lack of food. all of those things only got worse, not better, at least in the short term. We also saw, as a result, global and regional realignments happening. Egypt lost its power as sort of a regional hegemon. Iran is stepping in and asserting itself in more specific ways in places like Syria and Yemen. America has tried to step back a bit from the fray because they're not really sure how to deal with things anymore. And so this has created a rise of organizations initially like the GCC as a body, although that's been fractured by the rift between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on one side and Qatar on the other. Or you see countries like Turkey trying to play an increasing role. So we're seeing a reconfiguration of these global geopolitical interests and how they are or are not trying to re-engage with the new realities in the region. The governments that did survive, because there were a number of countries that the governments were not toppled, many of them, especially in my part of the region and the Arabian Peninsula, circled their wagons. They said, okay, this is a very dangerous thing. We may have survived this time, but there's no guarantee we'll survive next time unless we take more concerted efforts to work together to improve the security apparatus that we have. And so I'm saying, for example, within this part of the world, authoritarianism getting stronger, political freedoms declining, media freedoms declining, the rights to assembly declining, largely because the governments are issuing new regulations and rules to try and make sure that they are safeguarding against another potential uprisings. And I think maybe the most dangerous initial outcome of the uprisings and the way that they manifested was that people's aspirations about the possibility for something different actually happening have become tempered. That is, if you went out and marched and potentially could have been killed, you tried to overthrow the government, maybe you did overthrow your government, but you find yourself worse off in almost every other dimension, under greater authoritarian control, worse economic, political, social conditions, you will certainly not have much of an appetite to try this again, at least in the near future. So I think this has been one of the other major outcomes. And if we go to the next slide, this slide is a little bit old, but I like it. It's from The Economist, and it shows sort of the political conditions across the Middle East 5 years after the uprisings, and what a lot of political scientists like to talk about in terms of persistent authoritarianism. And that is, if you look here, blue represents those countries that have become more democratic. Only Tunisia falls within that category. In terms of the what we might call a more restricted democracy, and this is a very loose term, we might say, many of the countries are still there. Surprisingly, Egypt was listed as one, although I would say that's probably by now more of the orange color, which is the full autocracy. And then you see the failed states. And the three main failed states there, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, were three of the key states of the Arab uprisings. So that's no coincidence. Bahrain as well, you can't quite see it, but it's definitely a full autocracy as well. So things have not progressed very well from the citizens' point of view since the uprisings. So where are we now? Last time I was asked to do this talk, they titled it for me, and they talked about, it was something about glorifications of the revolutions in the Middle East. And while I wasn't sure about the title at first, I thought, well, they actually do have a point, because they raised the question, were the uprisings glorified? Were they really revolutions or reconstitutions? Did things turn out for the better? And as I've already pointed out, they haven't. We're on the next slide, by the way. We see, as I said, Libya is still in turmoil. Syria and Yemen are still in civil wars. Again, Iraq, which was one of the countries that saw a lot of instability, was, sorry, that's my alarm saying I talk too much. is still quite unstable. Egypt has greater authoritarianism. Bahrain, as I've said, is is really biding its time until the next thing. So it's not looking good. In the interest of time, since my alarm went off, let's go ahead and skip the next couple of slides and talk about the trajectories. So if you don't mind moving forward to the slide that mentions trajectories, I'll just try and wrap this up very quickly, and then we'll attempt the Q&A again. I've already said there's been a realignment of regional powers. The idea of democratic prospects looks unlikely in the short, maybe even the medium term. We don't really know if even democracy is the way that things might go. Each country is quite unique, and they all have their own aspirations and path dependencies. And the instability that led to the problems in the first place is likely to persist. A lot of economists now are talking about us being on the precipice of another major economic downturn. Those kind of conditions, again, could make things certainly more unstable in the region in the near future. But the thing is, the question remains about how much people are willing to try and attempt any kind of uprising again in the beginning. So I'd just like to then close with the next slide, that I do think that despite the fact that people are worried about what is possible through political mobilization, one thing that is certainly different is people have a renewed desire and a better understanding of that shared desire for better economic conditions and social justice. That's not going to go away, because the conditions that are leading to the poor economic conditions and the lack of social justice are only getting worse. But I think if, as outside observers, well, I'm inside, I guess, to some degree, but for those looking from the outside, I think expectations about what kind of changes these uprisings have created really need to be more of the long term. We need to be thinking about things in terms of decades or perhaps generations, not in terms of years, individual years. And the final point is, we might be able to look to Europe as an example. Now, I know that making comparisons between Europe in the 1700s and the Middle East now, there are maybe severe differences. But one thing that we can know from starting with the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille in the late 1700s, or the European revolutions that swept across Europe in the mid-1800s, it took literally generations and failed attempts at democratic consolidation and different kinds of political systems before we saw the kind of Europe that we know today, which is a Europe that does have consolidated democracies. And we do see, for example, in the European Union, fissures in how well those consolidated democracies can work together in a democratic fashion. And so the point here being that when it comes to major political changes of the nature that requires rewriting the social, economic, and political contract completely, we have to be patient to assume that it will take a long time if this is going to happen. And of course, there are still no guarantees that that will be the outcomes. So with that, I apologize for going a little bit over the allocated time, and I will open the floor or attempt to open the floor to whatever questions you have that I'm able to hear. So thank you very much for your patience and your concentration.